Hello everyone and welcome to the April 2023 ELSI Genomics Network seminar. And I'm Ainsley Newson. I'm a professor of bioethics at the University of Sydney and I convene this network. And I'm delighted today to welcome you to a discussion of sort of ethics in practice in fraught and uncertain contexts. And today we're using the example of genetic counselling in rapid acute neonatal genomic sequencing or acute care neonatal genomic sequencing. And we have two excellent speakers to take us through this discussion today. We first have Kirsten Boggs, and Kirsten, I'm just going to quickly look to the right to make sure I get your biography correct. Kirsten is a certified genetic counsellor and she has worked in mainly translational research settings for over 7 years now, including the Australian Genomics Project, Mackenzie's Mission Project, the preconception screening project, which was hosted by Australian Genomics. And more recently, she has just started working in an MRFF funded project to do with newborn genomic screening and starting to look at some of the feasibility for that. And as she's gone on in her career, Kirsten's work has taken on an increasing focus for ethical, legal and social issues. And we also have Dr. Fiona Lynch, who is a genetic counsellor and postdoctoral researcher at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and also the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. And Fiona completed her PhD in 2021, and she focused in her PhD on rapid genomic sequencing in critical unwell children, so is extremely well placed to talk to us today. But before we move on, I'd also like to first and most importantly acknowledge that we come together virtually. But for those of us who are in many places, including Australia, we are on unceded land, and that land in Australia belongs to Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. For me, that is the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, also known as the inner parts of Sydney. And I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may join us today. And there is a long tradition of learning on country, and we hope to extend and respect that long tradition of learning today. Okay, so I will also now, I think without further ado, hand over to Kirsten. We do have captions enabled for anyone who may require them or wish to use them. And the other thing I will mention before we go on is we'll have two short presentations. We'll have Kirsten first, followed by Fiona. I'll then open up the discussion to the audience for a broad Q&A. I do have a few pre-prepared questions, but I may not need to use them. And more towards the end of our session, we have an hour and a half budgeted today. And we like typically at the end of this event to go into breakout rooms, not to talk about this topic necessarily, but just to chat more generally with our colleagues, say hi, meet someone you've not met before. Not everybody can stay for that, but that's totally fine, of course. But if you wish to jump into a surprise breakout room and meet some new people, then you're very much encouraged and welcome to do so. So after we finish the more formal kind of panel-based proceedings, we will do that. Okay, so Kirsten, I'll invite you to now share your screen and tell us a little bit about acute care genomic sequencing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ainsley. Thanks for that lovely introduction. I am tasked with, I guess, introducing the acute care genomic study, and I understand that we have people joining us today from lots of different backgrounds. So really, I'm just going to give a broad overview of the study and what it was about so that it can inform our discussions. So firstly, I guess this was a huge study and a huge undertaking. Without the assistance and help of all of these people on screen, we just would not have been able to do the study at all. But particularly huge acknowledgement to our clinical lead, Zonitza Stark, and our laboratory lead, Sebastian Lunk, who I guess almost the dynamic duo of rapid genomics and, really went above and beyond for this study. So thank you to them. And I also acknowledge that they, along with the help of Sophie, our project officer, helped put these slides together. So in terms of rare diseases. I guess this is what we're talking about for acute care, and that we were diagnosing pediatric rare disease. So individually, obviously, rare diseases are rare, but are collectively actually fairly common, and about 1 in 17 Australians are affected by rare disease at some point across their lifetime. 80% of those people affected are children, and very sadly, 30% of babies affected by rare disease will die in the first year of their life. Now, traditionally with genomic testing, I guess even 5-6 years ago, when we were offering genomic testing, we were doing this sort of at the end of a diagnostic odyssey for most families. And so what that means is that a lot of families, will have a suspicion something's wrong, potentially be admitted to hospital, see lots and lots and lots of specialists, and genetics would kind of come in at the end. And I guess as a sort of last resort, offer genetic testing to see if we can make a diagnosis in a child. Now, technology has changed rapidly over the last few years, and traditionally was taking sort of on average about 5 years to make a diagnosis for a child. Now, obviously with this study, but with broader access to genomic sequencing, that is much shorter. And I guess to also say that less than 5% of rare diseases have access to treatment. So we're hoping that, that changes as well. So why does time matter? Essentially, the statistics say that 5% of neonatal ICU admissions will have an underlying genetic condition. In terms of an ICU stay, for the health economists and people from government, this costs roughly about $4,500 per day to keep a child in ICU. But more importantly, for the families and for the clinicians looking after these children, decisions are made in minutes and hours and not in months and years. So it's kind of thinking about, access to genomic testing, and for that testing to be taking months, what is the value of that in an ICU setting? So this is a busy slide, but essentially just kind of shows how, I guess, funding models and all of this came about. So probably importantly to mention that Melbourne Genomics, founded, in Melbourne and run out of Melbourne and Victoria in 2013. And then we have Australian Genomics, which was looking at the implementation of genomic testing across the country. And that was funded through an NHMRC grant in 2014, although started actively recruiting patients in 2016. And that's sort of when I became involved in the study. So originally we were offering, I guess, longer term genomic sequencing for children to try and make a diagnosis. So again, that was sort of taking weeks and months. But part of that study, we set up the acute care flagship, which was looking at offering rapid genomic sequencing, so at a quicker scale. And then you can see here in 2019, the Genomics Health Futures mission funds were announced. And so that was also beneficial for us from an acute care perspective, because we were able to extend our study using funding from that. So Melbourne Genomics started all of this in 2016 and 2017. They were offering rapid whole exome sequencing to critically unwell children in neonatal ICU and in pediatric ICU. This started out, I think, roughly, and there'll be people from Melbourne Genomics on this, I'm sure, so can correct me, but I think was taking sort of weeks to get results back, so 2 to 3 weeks rather than days, but that certainly set the scene and showed that we were able to do that. In 2018, we started the acute care flagship funded by Australian Genomics. So I should mention here, this was only available to children in Victoria. whereas from 2018, that was available across the country. So for that study, that was through Australian Genomics, we were offering trio rapid whole exome sequencing, so testing both parents and the child to see if we could find a diagnosis for that child. So the whole exome sequencing was taking sort of between 5 to 7 days, but roughly a 5-day turnaround time for that cohort. And then based on what we found here, we were able to get access to further funding from MRFF. And we had a subsequent cohort that went through from 2020 through to 2020, well, actually 2022 in the end. And those children had access to whole genome sequencing with a turnaround time of roughly about 3 days. So these are kind of the questions that we were asking as part of the acute care study. You know, how do we actually deliver this? How do we deliver results in under 5 days from a laboratory perspective? Is consent actually meaningful in this context when, you know, talking to families in such a traumatic environment? Which patients do we actually offer testing to? How do families experience the process? And Fiona will certainly be able to speak to that later on. What is the diagnostic utility? What is the clinical utility? Do results impact decisions made by families and clinicians? Is it a fair use of resources? You know, it does cost a lot to offer rapid whole genome sequencing. Roughly about $15,000 actually is the price that it costs for rapid trio whole genome sequencing. So is it cost effective is also something that we were asking as well. So our entire cohort, we had more than 320 children go through the study. Most of those were recruited through NICU and PICUs across the country, but some were ward patients that were, I guess, due to exceptional circumstances were admitted into the study. So as I said, we had a cohort that had trio whole exome sequencing from 2018 through to 2019, and then a cohort that had access to trio whole genome sequencing. The average time to report was about 3 days, and across both cohorts, we had more than 50% diagnostic yield, meaning that we made a diagnosis for around half of the families that we saw through the study. This is just a map to show that we had involvement from every state and territory across the country, which was amazing. The first cohort, I don't know that we had everybody on board, but certainly by the time we were offering whole genome sequencing, every state and territory had at least one site that was recruiting. And obviously we'd be recruiting from major paediatric hospitals and hospitals that had major neonatal intensive care units. So our first cohort, the ones that had access to trio whole exome sequencing, we have published on this, and we will be publishing soonish about our second cohort, those that had access to whole genome sequencing. So we had 108 patients who had access to rapid whole exome sequencing. We made a diagnosis in 53% of those children. Of those that achieved a diagnosis, we had 75% change in management. So what we meant by change in management was either they had subsequent investigations or subspecialist referrals made, so 18 patients. Very sadly, we had 13 patients where, based on the results, families made the decision to withdraw care. And then we also had 11 patients who had access to medications that they were not previously on based on the results. For those who did not have a diagnosis, there was still a change in management for 15% of those children. And that's because, I guess, potentially people were thinking that there was a specific underlying genetic diagnosis that we didn't find. And so for those children, some of those managed to avoid, pretty invasive biopsies here based on the results, even though we didn't achieve a diagnosis. For the children who had access to acute care testing, roughly equated to 140 fewer days in hospital, which is a savings of, you know, $630,000 per child, which is fairly significant. And I guess that brings me to my role as a genetic counsellor. So I was involved in the consenting and result delivery for over 100, probably close to 150 families across 2 major paediatric hospitals here in Sydney. And, you know, it was really, I guess, about how do we make the consent process meaningful, given, you know, it's such a traumatic time in people's lives, and certainly probably one of the worst times in people's lives, but also helping to explain the results and doing that in a meaningful way as well, and supporting families through that process. So with that, I will stop sharing and pass over to Fiona.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Fiona, are you happy just to go straight over?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ainsley. And thanks, Kirsten. And I guess it's just wonderful to reflect on what a huge and multifaceted project this has been over the past 5 years. I guess I don't have any slides to share with you, but I really wanted to just tell you a little bit about the story of the past 5 years. And I've had the privilege of being an observer on this project over that time. So I joined the Acute Care Genomics Project at the start of 2018, so at the start of my PhD, and I had the opportunity to really take my research in whatever direction felt useful and interested me. So my PhD focused on the parent experiences, so the family experiences, as well as the health professional experiences of delivering rapid acute care genomics. And I guess over that time, I've really had the opportunity to observe how this space has grown and developed, how practice has developed, and how genetic counselling practice in particular has changed over that time, and all of the lessons that we've learned along the way. And I guess at this point in time, I see, 5 years into the project, with a particular interest in some of the ethical issues in this area. And I think really at this point in time, and this is Australia and discussions that are happening overseas as well, I think there are really 2 prevailing ethical issues here, and ones that are getting, I guess, the most attention in terms of discussion in the literature, as well as discussion with colleagues and health professionals locally and internationally. So I think the first of these is really about the impact of rapid genomic sequencing and rapid genomic diagnosis on treatment decisions. And I guess this ties in a little bit with the health economics argument here too. So this discussion is really around, should we deliver rapid genomic sequencing in acute care? What benefit does it have? And obviously Kirsten's presented there some really wonderful benefits. The rapid genomic sequencing has the potential to deliver a diagnosis for children that leads to some life-saving treatment or management. The flip side of that coin is that it has the potential to deliver a really devastating diagnosis that can influence treatment decisions of both clinicians and families, potentially leading patients towards palliative care earlier than they would have otherwise accessed that. And so that ties in with that health economics argument, in that if children die earlier, they're using less healthcare resources, and so they're actually saving the health system money. And that can be a really uncomfortable discussion to have, both with families, but as well as in terms of an ethical discussion among colleagues. The second of the prevailing issues that I think are still being discussed, and certainly one that I'm more interested in, and one that I think is maybe more relevant to genetic counsellors as well, is the issue of consent. And this is really sort of a 2-pronged discussion here, I think. So if we decide that we are going to offer families rapid genomic sequencing, we are going to offer this to patients, there's a question here about whether informed consent is necessary. So I'm sure many of you will be aware of the challenges of obtaining informed consent for genomic sequencing in all settings. genomic sequencing is complicated. Parents are driven by different motivations, and we're asking them to make decisions about their children. And this is a complex discussion that you might often spend an hour or multiple sessions with parents discussing. When we're talking to parents in in an acute care setting, we've got all of those complexities in addition to the huge amount of stress that parents are under having a critically unwell child. A lot of these children are days old, and so parents are potentially recovering from birth or still in hospital in the case of the birthing parent. So they're highly stressed. It's a really time-pressured environment. So we're asking parents to make a decision very quickly, which may not necessarily be the case in the outpatient setting. So we've got all of those complexities that we're asking parents to make a decision based on. So there's a question here about whether consent for rapid genomic sequencing is necessary. There are some differing views on this. Some will argue that plenty of things happen in the NICU, for example, that don't require explicit parental consent. Some sort of life-saving urgent treatment will just happen without asking the parents first. And plenty of other tests and investigations will occur as well without explicit parental consent. So there's some that have argued that potentially rapid genomic sequencing should fall into that category. Others, and maybe those coming more from a genetics background, and maybe this is coming from an area of this idea of genetic exceptionalism as well, that genetics and genomics is special in some way, will argue that rapid genomic sequencing does require explicit consent. You know, there are lots of considerations. We know all about the issues with incidental findings and uncertain findings, impact on additional family members and insurance implications. All of these additional considerations that we should be allowing parents to make decisions based on. So if we decide that consent is necessary and that parents should be given the option to make the decision about whether or not their child should access rapid genomic sequencing, there's the second issue of how to obtain that informed consent. So how do we best facilitate informed decision-making for these families in, as I described, that highly stressful, time-pressured environment? And I think that's still really an ongoing discussion. So I think they're the main sort of prevailing ethical issues that I'm still interested in, and certainly I think that are still being discussed and explored and don't necessarily have any resolution yet. There are lots of other discussions to be had about rapid genomic sequencing in this setting. And then I guess it's implications for how we deliver genomic testing in other settings as well that I think are really interesting to explore. That's where I'm sitting at the moment. And I guess I'm hoping that we can ask some questions and have some discussion about these issues today.
So much, Fiona. And I've just seen a comment pop up from Steph actually in the chat, just for the benefit of the recording. Steph, just before I read out your comment, I'd invite you, if you like, to unmute and raise it with the group as well. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, thank you. Right.
Yeah. Your sound isn't amazing to me. Is it just me?
Oh.
Kirsten, are you saying, or Fiona, are you saying as well? Sorry,
Yeah.
You're coming in and out a little bit.
Yeah, just cutting in and out, Steph, sorry.
Another go, and then if it doesn't work, I might read it for you if that's okay. Sorry.
Is that a little better? I've just changed my, I don't know, some sort of setting. I was just, really interested in hearing you talk about that, Fiona, and especially with the backdrop that Kirsten had provided. And I was just thinking about how we make these decisions around testing and what sort of ethical, priorities we give. And yeah, I guess we are sort of prioritizing that concept of autonomy when we're requiring an informed consent process for testing. And I wonder, because this is a new space and, the benefits are certainly evident, but maybe as we just get more comfortable with, the clear benefit that this testing can provide, then we can sort of back off from, making sure that parents have every piece of possible information that we think is necessary in other sort of genetic counselling contexts. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really the crux of the issue, Steph. I guess something I didn't mention, I think at the beginning of the project, I certainly came to it with the assumption that genomic testing is inherently good. And if it has the potential to have these hugely life-saving benefits, then it should be offered. If parents are saying we can't possibly give consent, then we should just be going ahead with it. Kirsten, I know you and I have had this discussion. I guess if all of the parents that were offered rapid genomic sequencing said yes, I think that would make this a much easier decision to make. If everyone was saying yes, then why are we even bothering asking for consent? But there are parents who decline it. And I think that's going to be really important to constantly come back to. There are families who choose to say no after that process of pre-test counselling and facilitating informed decision-making. There are some families who don't want it. And so I think that's really important to remember when we're having these discussions about whether consent is necessary or not. If people are making different decisions, that means that families have different perspectives, different priorities. And I think we need to be respecting that autonomy, right? Kirsten, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, look, I guess I'm going to say a very genetic counsellor-y thing here, but it's so family dependent, and actually, depending on what background they come from, what lived experience they have, a lot of these families, unlike traditional genetic counselling, have had kind of no exposure to the hospital system, genetics in general. And I think, to Fiona's point, that we have had people that have declined acute care testing for whatever reason. And I guess a lot of those people, at least the ones that I saw that declined, originally were quite keen to go ahead. And then after having a discussion about the ins and outs and potential implications of the results, changed their mind, based on the information that we gave. I think it's important to remember that these are highly stressed families, and actually giving people time to consider whether they want to go ahead with this kind of testing is incredibly important, and certainly something that I learnt along the way was of huge value, because what's right for them one day won't be right for them the next, and things change very quickly in an ICU setting. And so just because they decline one day, things might take a turn for the worse, and then they might decide that actually, the worst has happened, and now that they really need a diagnosis. I'm fascinated by, I guess, this concept of genetic exceptionalism and, how we kind of balance that, because I think for some families, absolutely a detailed consent process is not necessary, and perhaps, they could do that online and kind of look at their own information and make decisions based on that. But I think there still needs to be support for those who can't do that or, are unable to come to a decision.
Okay, there is so much there already. Thank you to both of you for just being firstly, so unbelievably articulate about really complex issues, but, really framing this discussion brilliantly. For those watching the recording, the chat is absolutely going off. I'll come back to that in a second. I also see your hand, Lisa. I should also say, if you'd like to ask a question live, do use the raise hand function, because there's a lot of you here and it will maximise the chance that I will see you. Lisa, I'll come to you in just a second, but there are just a little collection of comments. I will try to get to everything that's been raised in the chat, but there's just kind of a couple of points for clarification around the decliners that I think you mentioned first, Fiona. And so, for example, I think Georgie asks whether the reasons for declining have been explored. So that was one thing that's interesting. Aideen asks whether we know if anyone's changed their mind later or whether they will change their mind later. Is this a kind of has to happen on day 3, or can they, is there a bit of time like we sometimes have in genetic counselling or genetics more generally? Lindsay also asked the same question around reasons as to why. And I think that's all the kind of quick factual clarifications. So unless something's happened further down in the meantime. So just to summarise, I think there's why do people decline? Do we know? And I guess I'd add a third thing, sorry, just to make it even more complicated. 3 questions now. Off the top of your head, do either of you know what proportion of people who are offered this say no? Secondly, what reasons do they give? And thirdly, have they got an opportunity to change their mind? So just a couple of quick factual points that either of you are welcome or both of you are welcome to take. And then I'll come to you, Lisa, and then everybody putting brilliant reflections in the chat, I'll come to those as well. Making my job easy. I can already see I'm not going to need the questions I prepared earlier.
I'll just make a really quick comment that I guess it's been really disappointing that we haven't been able to empirically explore reasons for declining. Just because these families declined rapid genomic testing, they also declined to be part of the research project. So they're not research participants and we can't collect any data from them. And I think that's a huge limitation, but I know that Kirsten's got some anecdotal evidence to reflect on.
Sure do. Thanks, Fiona. I guess in terms of numbers, I don't know off the top of my head how many across the country we had decline, but I would say it's probably about 5% or less. Yeah, I don't know that it would be higher than 5%. Look, I had a huge range of test decliners, reasons for test declining. So I guess we had people who were quite worried about data security and were really worried about, just the storage of genomic information and that would be stored somewhere, and, declined any kind of genetic testing. So had a few, maybe 1 or 2 families decline based on that. We had people decline based on the risk of incidental findings. Now, obviously through counselling, we explored that a lot and talked about the risk being quite low, sort of about 1%, but they were just not ready for any kind of additional information on top of what they were already going through. And so declined testing that way. I feel like those families potentially had access to other genetic testing down the track, sort of panel-based testing, which is far less likely to find an incidental finding, so potentially still achieved a diagnosis that way. But overwhelmingly, I would say the reasoning is that it was just too much for people to make that decision at that point in time, given, and this maybe takes us back to the, exceptionalism of genetics, but given that a genetic result can really take away hope for people, and just that permanence of this is the diagnosis, there's nothing that we can do really. I mean, a lot of the diagnoses that we were giving were really awful, and there's often, hopefully this changes in the future, but at the moment there's often not a treatment or a cure available. And so I was, I guess, initially maybe not, I went into this a bit naively and didn't quite appreciate that, but certainly, really changed the way that I counselled families, thinking about the potential implications of finding a genetic diagnosis, particularly for really young babies where, the baby was sort of only 5 days old or something, and just how overwhelming that and devastating that diagnosis can be. And so I think giving people time, and to go back to answer that question, is that yes, if people declined and then contacted us later down the track, as long as there hadn't been other genetic testing done, we were able to initiate this pathway. We did have some people who declined or just wanted to wait and see how their baby did, or maybe wait for an array to be done, sort of spacing things out and giving people an opportunity to really come to terms with the fact that actually there's something's even wrong with their baby. They haven't even had time to process that yet. So trying to ask them to make a decision about this, which could be potentially life-changing. Just giving people time, I think, is really important. but not for everyone, but for those who need it. I hope I haven't waffled too much and that made sense.
No, that was really powerful, at least from my perspective. Fiona, would you like to add anything to what Kirsten said?
Oh, look, I don't think so. Just similar to what I said before, I think this is a really important area of research and something that needs to be explicitly explored. I think that those views of decliners is something that we're really missing. It's something that's missing in a lot of research, and I don't have the solutions as to how we access those people. But yeah, I think they're a really important voice to be heard.
Yeah, and I'm just going to flag to pin for later the exceptionalism question too, because I think we should definitely come back to that if it doesn't happen organically in the discussion. Lisa Dye from UTS, you've been very patient. I'm going to let you ask your question now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ainsley, and thanks, Kirsten and Fiona. Such an interesting topic. Now, the discussion about the reasons why people decline this kind of testing is related to my question. So I thought, Kirsten, you did such a nice, you had such a nice slide of all the benefits of this kind of testing, the good things that can come, or the clarity and yeah, I guess broadly classified as benefits. And then Fiona, I thought your observation and that some people do decline it is very interesting as a counterpoint to that very clear statement of the benefits of this kind of testing. And so I was already, but before this discussion about the reasons for declining came up, I was already starting to think about have you thought about trying to map the potential harms of this kind of testing, like going sort of, I guess, in a way, almost abstracting away from the reasons why people might decline and sort of mapping those against the benefits, and even looking beyond that immediate acute situation to, I don't know enough about the science, but whether these kinds of results might have implications for other family members in the wider family, or for reproductive planning for the parents in the future, and those kinds of things. I guess I could say more, but I'll stop and just see if you have any comments there.
Yeah, I can talk to that. I think there's been a bit of discussion in the literature, and Ainsley, I'm thinking about your piece from a few years ago with Dominic Wilkinson and others, that I think has a really nice sort of pros and cons of rapid genomic sequencing in NICU. A lot of them are very similar to genomic sequencing in other settings. So pros and cons, that we would be familiar with in an outpatient setting. They tend to be things like the risk of uncertain results and incidental findings. I don't know if much more has been done on that, and I think a lot of the evidence presented in the literature is obviously very pro rapid genomic sequencing. It's really spouting the benefits of this amazing new technology in the context of vying for funding for it. So yeah, I think it's maybe something that we need to continue considering. I think it's important to recognize the benefits in terms of, making funding available for it. So that if families do want to access it, it's free. But I guess recognizing too that, yeah, there are downsides, and for some families, they might outweigh the benefits. And so maybe in that context, then facilitating informed decision-making is going to be really important.
Yeah, I love that point that you made, that because there are some potential harms or issues that would cause some families to decline, that makes it so important to get consent right, to do consent really well. So thank you. That's really interesting.
Thank you. MJ, I see your hand too, but I'm just going to go to one of the first comments on the chat just to try and balance the comments in the chat with comments in the room. And Eliza Courtney, who's a genetic counsellor in Sydney, currently also doing a PhD, because there's lots of high achieving genetic counsellors in Australia, which is awesome, is asking about kind of, I guess, tweaks to consent in the sense of to try and balance, I guess, these considerations. But Eliza, rather than me say your question for you, if you're on the line still, I'd invite you to unmute and raise your question to the panelists if you wish to.
Hey, Ainsley, my partner's just in a meeting just next door and she's very loud.
No, that's okay. I can't hear her, but are you happy for me to read out your comment then?
Yeah, that would be good.
Sure, no worries. Okay, so Eliza is asking whether there could be something like, for example, a two-step consent process. The first step being the results of immediate treatment relevance being returned without need for explicit consent. So that's kind of addressing the key rationale for this testing. But also, I think, Kirsten, in your explanation, you sort of talked about the fact that this is sometimes, or actually increasingly, a trio-based test as well to, I guess, first help with interpretation. So if you find a gene change or a variant in a parent and they're asymptomatic, that might help you with interpreting the results for the baby, but also, you know, to maximise the potential future value of this information as well, as Lisa was talking about with reproductive decision making. But so maybe we could focus on the here and now, you know, what is the absolute driver for this test at this point in time, and then have a consent discussion later down the track for other kind of less immediate findings, just to kind of, you know, break up that potential overwhelm. And in fact, we have models for this already, which I think is also being used in the RAPID projects around secondary additional name of your choice findings down the track. So maybe sort of taking a leaf from that book. Is that something that has been discussed, I guess, either of you, Fiona, perhaps in your PhD work where you interviewed health professionals providing this, or Kirsten, in your own direct experience?
Sure. Fiona, do you, I can talk to this.
No, go for it.
Interesting question. We actually did do, I guess, a two-step consent process for our second cohort, which I didn't go into for the interest of time. But essentially, anybody who had trio whole genome sequencing, so as part of that cohort, we actually went back to those families sort of 6 months post-result to offer them additional findings should they want them. So that sub-study has probably just really wrapped up. I think I've given the last of the results, at least for the New South Wales families. So we were offering adult onset findings based on the ACMG gene list, so medically actionable or treatable adult onset conditions for each parent. We were also offering reproductive carrier screening, so that was based on the Mackenzie's mission gene list, and that was for both parents as a couple. And then we were also offering pediatric onset findings for the child if the child was still alive at the point of us contacting them. So that study, I mean, obviously we'll be writing up a lot about all of that, but certainly that's kind of what we did in terms of additional findings. So that will be quite interesting to see how that goes. So watch this space. I guess just thinking about, you know, focusing on, you know, the reason for doing the test and that rapid diagnosis. Again, it's really tricky because I think we weren't sure, even later in the study, we were not certain about what diagnoses we were going to get, right? So the reason that we were offering the testing was hopefully we'll find something that's treatable, or there's some kind of management that will help this child and this family. But often we didn't know. It was kind of like a broad, we think it's, you know, within this category of diagnoses. And unfortunately, we really couldn't be sure until we kind of got the diagnosis. And so while we were very hopeful that it would be treatable or something, you know, as I said before, often it wasn't. And I guess, you know, that's sort of something that comes into it. And obviously, I think, you know, as we move into the future and our knowledge becomes better and better, obviously that will change, and the more sort of treatments that become available over time. But certainly at this point in time, I think it's just a really difficult concept, given that we just don't know what we're going to find until we find it. Yeah.
I've moved rooms. Sorry about that. Thanks, Kirsten. That was yeah, and it'd be interesting to see the findings from the additional findings study. I guess the thing is that it's in a rapid setting because there's a thought that perhaps at least some of the results will have immediate relevance to the care of that child. Otherwise, we wouldn't need it in a rapid context. And so I just think that, I know it adds resource burden and logistical issues because sometimes you have dropout of parents. They, you know, kind of fall into the abyss of follow-up care and whatnot. So it does add logistical issues, but I guess trying to balance the potential benefits and harms, if the result does have immediate clinical consequence to the management of that child, then it's really in the best interests of the child, and that prevails over parental autonomy. And I think sometimes we place too much importance on parental autonomy and decision making in the context of children. We forget about their autonomy, especially for children who can't express that autonomy when they're, newborn babies. So I just wonder also whether, we could be using things like e-consent models where parents can go back and revise information in their own time when they've, not necessarily having to come into a genetic counselling consultation. They can do it when they're feeling comfortable at home and really think through, okay, well, findings that don't have immediate relevance to my child's well-being and health, how do I feel about them? And then that can be afforded the time to consider those potential benefits and harms related to that.
Thank you to you both for your contributions there. And I think for now, we'll just move on to another question. MJ, you've been really patient with your hand up. I'll invite you to speak, and then I'll come back to the online chat as well. Thanks, MJ.
Thanks, Ainsley. My question, of course, is about the data security and storage concerns that come up in the consenting and the declining process. And I guess I just wondered how well equipped GCs feel to have that conversation. Is that a conversation, given it's a very challenging area? And, what support might GCs need to have that discussion if it's needed, or is it just a case of the process is more like, people are concerned, they don't want to proceed, and that's, we respect that, and that's the end of the discussion.
Great question, and one that I think really also goes to the heart of what's driving our discussion today, which is not just the substantive ethical issues that arise in this space, but actually how they are experienced by the folks who are doing them as part of their job or going through them as part of their professional role. I guess that can be relevant for both Fiona and Kirsten. Like, Fiona, did it come up in any of your interviews? And Kirsten, did you experience it? So maybe Fiona first.
Yeah, a couple of the families that I interviewed mentioned data security, but very much in passing. It wasn't a focus of their experience. And I guess as well, all of the parents that I interviewed had consented to rapid genomic sequencing. So while this might have been a concern, it obviously wasn't enough of a concern to deter them from consenting. In terms of whether GCs feel prepared to have these discussions, Kirsten?
I guess I felt prepared, but that is because I had the support of the study, right? So if I had questions about how specific things were stored, I could just go back to project officer, lab people. I knew who to ask to get answers to those questions. So I guess it depends on the types of questions that we get asked. So some will be quite broad, and obviously I can answer those quite easily, but for specific data privacy concerns, I knew the people to go back to. Whereas I guess if you're sort of out doing this without the support of a research program, potentially you may not know who to ask or where to go. It was quite interesting, I think, reflecting on the time period that people were most concerned about data security was actually when there was a lot of discussion in the media about my health record. So people were quite concerned because they'd heard about the concerns of my health record. And so that's kind of where it came from. I don't know also whether there was some kind of TV show or something that everybody had watched, but there was some running theme of people asking, would we store genetic information, and then if their child grew up and committed a crime, would the police then be able to release their genomic data and sort of find them that way? So there was a few and sort of around the same time period as that. So I wonder if there was something going on in the media or a show that had that as a as an issue that came up. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and Catherine's just put in the chat Golden State Killer, which I think is a US case, which is exactly what happened as far as I'm aware. At least it might have had something to do with ancestry testing, but there's quite a few themes coming through in the chat. There's some technical kind of points and clarification, this theme of kind of consent to the acute information versus the longer term implications. There's some really nuanced points being made around adjustment, uncertainty, parents feeling pressured to be tested when actually they may not be ready to receive the information that's being provided. Helen, you've got your hand up, and I think it's also you that popped a comment in the chat around the kind of implications for future care. So would you like to speak to your either that comment or whatever it was that you put your hand up about as well?
Sure, thanks Ainsley. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thanks Fiona and Kirsten for your presentations, and this is such an interesting area. And I happen to be seeing a family this week for an acute care case, so I just feel like I've got a lot of thoughts and probably a lot related to the current family that I'm seeing. I think in my comment in the chat was really just to say that as a genetic counsellor, I found it both reassuring that I had questions coming back from the parents about what will it mean for my child if there's a genetic diagnosis and it's not a good one? Will they stop looking after our baby? And I found that quite confronting at the same time and difficult to respond to. And the way that we responded, I was working with a genetic counselling student who was actually amazing as well, was to say that the doctors will always have their babies' care in the best interests, and that they'll be using this information to, I guess, target treatment and have conversations with parents, and that wouldn't be a decision that was made, without their input. But I guess ultimately in these situations, no one will ignore a genetic diagnosis if it's indicating that it's a life-limiting condition. And it was just very difficult, a very difficult conversation, and knowing that the parents had a lot of hope before we did the test. And as you said, Kirsten, this test has the ability to take away that hope. And I really did use that language when speaking with them. They didn't go ahead with testing the day that we met with them. And then I had to walk out of the room and was met by a group of about 7 doctors who were waiting to hear, were they going ahead with the test? And we stood there and we said, no, they're not going ahead with the testing today. And actually the doctors were very, a lot more understanding of that than I anticipated. So that was really great. And I think that these parents actually just didn't want their little baby to have any more needles that day because she'd had so much invasive testing. But I think it's just really difficult as a genetic counsellor. You've got in your own head, how much do I push, a challenge, or, and I think we laid out the information and they made a decision to hold on for a few days. But you do have the medical side and the potential benefits, and then you've got the worry, and we're dealing with all that ourselves as well. So anyway, thanks for listening to me. I think I just thought this was a great space to just share some of my experiences and thoughts as genetic counsellor as they are happening this week in this context. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Helen. That's really powerful. And I think certainly, the experience that I've had multiple times across this study with multiple families, and that sort of discomfort of feeling like you want to prepare people for, I guess, worst case scenario, so that they are making an informed decision, but not wanting to remove hope, and by saying, well, yeah, actually, we might find some horrible diagnosis. And I mean, obviously I would never say this like this, but we might find something terrible, and actually that potentially the doctors would consider palliation. And I think even just saying things like palliation in that context is really difficult for people, for families to think about. Interesting. I'm glad that the doctors were very supportive of the decision that family made. I can't say that that has been my experience across the study for all clinicians that I've met, although I think we did a good job of kind of educating them as we brought them along with us. And certainly I think for me, just being more confident in that sort of advocacy role of, you know, actually they don't want this and these are the reasons why, how about we just leave them for a day and we'll come back. And to kind of, yeah, I think just really speak on behalf of the family, which is not, you know, unique to this situation for genetic counsellors. This is kind of what we do, but it's just for, I guess, that hierarchy of the doctors and feeling quite, I don't know, that you're not, you know, the ICU is not a space that I was in prior to this. So it was a lot about learning about my own confidence and using those skills. And I think also, you know, we train in, and I think this is changing in genetic counselling anyway, but I guess that non-directive approach to genetic counselling, certainly I became much more directive in the way that I spoke to families. And, you know, if I could see that they were struggling to make a decision, I would actually say, hey, let's put a stop to this discussion. I'll give you an hour. I'll give you the afternoon. How about I come back tomorrow? You know, just to make sure that they weren't rushing their decision or making a decision without having properly thought about it.
Thank you, Kirsten. Oh, sorry, Fiona. I don't even need to chair this. You guys have got this totally without me. I'm just going to enjoy it. Would you like to add something to what Kirsten said, Fiona?
I would love to. Helen, I have so many thoughts about what you just said, and I'm trying to sort of organise them all in my mind. I think a lot of what you said is really reflected in the literature on genetic counsellors' experiences of working in this setting. I guess the other comment I wanted to make is that I'm really pleased to hear that you've got a student working with you, because I think there was some hesitancy at the beginning that this is a really a protected patient cohort and one that we don't want to necessarily I guess let inexperienced genetic counsellors or certainly students in on. So I think it's really wonderful to see that brand new GCs are getting some experience in this area. In terms of the impact on treatment decisions, I think this is a really interesting area, and it's actually something that a master's student of ours has just finished up a project and is currently preparing a paper on. So this was a survey, an international survey looking at how intensive care clinicians would use particular genetic testing results to inform their treatment and management decisions. And we explored a couple of different diagnoses with different outcomes, and it was really interesting to see some of their thoughts on that. So keep an eye out for that. I had other things that I thought of, but they've gone out of my mind now, but I'm sure they'll come back.
Okay, how about I just jump back in for a sec and then you can ponder. I was going to invite Anne Price, if you're still here. You popped a comment in around, I guess, uncertainty, coming to terms with information. Anne is a clinical ethicist in the Sydney Children's Hospital Network and has a lot of experience talking with families in uncertain situations across the board, not just genetics. So Anne, are you still in the call?
I am here, Ainsley. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes. Yeah. Would you like to speak to your comment?
Yeah, I mean, Fiona made a big claim, I think, in saying this is an inherent good. And I do think we have to interrogate that in the context of the clinic or in the clinical encounter. As Kirsten said, you know, this is a challenging space for parents. They have not experienced the circumstances they're in before. We talk about consent in terms of understanding and sharing values and preferences, and yet mostly people who are in these circumstances have never thought about what their values and preferences might be. So it is a very challenging, and I don't think it's different to a lot of circumstances. I think it's someone in the chat put out that, you know, a lot of the decisions that are made in these environments are similar. So I don't think it's exceptionalist in that stage, but in that way. But I do think there are ramifications not only for the child but for the family and extended family that perhaps can be lifelong. And I do think it's reasonable to have some concerns about that sort of time, that time frame, and that parents should be able to resist at least. And often we're talking about iterative conversations that can't be sort of made in one short discussion, and I know that the genetic counsellors do an amazing job in framing those discussions. But we have a lot of discussion in ethics about what makes good shared decision making. And it's not just about sharing information, it's about sharing values. And I think that needs to happen over a period of time. It needs to be nuanced, it needs to be particular to the family themselves and their circumstances. And sometimes rapid genomic testing doesn't, because of the nature of it, doesn't allow for those sort of more iterative conversations, just by nature of requiring, you know, the time frame that it does. So I think there's a lot to consider, and that it's also some of these things that are thrown up are heterogeneous. They're not always, we don't always know the answers. So labeling can be good in terms of treatment and in terms of funding for treatments. But if it throws up something that is not determinative, then that can be very difficult, because as many of the people in this session have brought up, it can frame a family's hope, and that can actually lead to them making choices that they perhaps wouldn't have made if they hadn't known that diagnosis, regarding whether they will support ongoing treatment for their child, whether they will move down a palliative path with the support of the clinicians, but earlier than they would have. And that can have costs to you know, their future planning for reproductive well-being, but also many other things in their life. So I think it's a very nuanced discussion, and I'm really pleased to hear that how everyone is like framing this in such nuanced terms. So great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And it's wonderful to have a clinical ethicist's eye in here as well, to sort of get someone's commented in the chat that they loved the iterative discussion point. And I think that's really important, because it's about the process here, not just the substantive issues, which I think you've articulated really well. Fiona, I guess briefly, because there's still a couple of things I'd like to pick up on, and we are rapidly running out of time, actually. So I just thought I'd see if you had anything in very quickly to kind of reflect on Anne's comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Anne. And I think I should clarify my comment about thinking that rapid genomic sequencing is an inherent good. I think the assumption in the literature and the assumption of all of these clinical trials, all of this evidence that is presented, is to show that rapid genomic sequencing is an inherent good. You know, here are all of the wonderful benefits of it. And maybe potentially there's not enough discussion about some of the risks. I think I've certainly moved in the way that I talk about decision-making in this setting from this idea of getting consent, consenting families. And I think this is often how the role of a genetic counsellor is seen in this setting as well, and potentially in some outpatient settings as well. A GC is there to get consent. But that's not what we do. We facilitate informed decision-making, and that decision might be to go ahead with rapid genomic sequencing, to not go ahead with it, to delay it, or potentially, if there are other options, other genetic testing available, to facilitate that informed decision-making. And yes, that's an iterative process. Yes, that's a process that involves more than just educating families. This is what we do as genetic counsellors every day, right? So I think genetic counsellors are really well placed to be performing this role in this setting. And I think, I hope that a lot of the literature locally and internationally, particularly internationally, where they're not necessarily using genetic counsellors in a lot of their studies, is starting to realise the importance of getting GCs involved to support these families, to facilitate that informed decision-making.
Thanks so much, Fiona. I feel like exceptionalism has been the elephant in the room for the whole of this discussion so far. And I think there's probably and I feel like the discussion is going in different ways, where some elements suggest that it's not exceptional because actually there is just information here that's going to directly inform treatment. And then on the other hand, you know, the potential for trio testing and all the implications that can give rise to maybe suggest that there are elements here that make it a little bit more in the vein of so-called genetic exceptionalism, and pushing it more into the realm where the norms of genetic counselling and practice in clinical genetics that have defined our field for decades might come into play. Peter Kalb's been quite active in the chat, and I'm not sure if you're still here, Peter, but you've made a few really interesting and important technical but also substantive points. if you're still here, I wonder if you just want to comment on your take on the exceptionalism question. It might be that Peter's gone or is not in a situation where they can comment. I'll ask our panellists in just a second, but just to quickly summarise some of the other bits and pieces that are coming up in the chat. Nikki Conway, who actually had to leave, made the point that the other thing that's happening here, which many of us are involved with, is some of the trials now underway to look at the role that genomics might play in early life more broadly, including in newborn screening as the public health intervention, not just in the rapid space. And actually kind of thinking about all of these interventions, assuming they go forward to practice, which obviously is still a ways away in terms of evidence and policy, around building in mechanisms for greater engagement with parents from the get-go, both maybe even pre-pregnancy, but also during pregnancy. So something to think about there, so that perhaps people aren't caught unawares. Oh, we've got Peter has just popped his hand up now as well. Hey, Peter, how are you doing?
Good, Ainsley. Thanks very much. Sorry, I didn't have a mic connected, so that's why I had to dabble
well, thank
around.
you for making the effort. We really appreciate it.
I only got onto the webinar a bit later on. Yeah, so the 2 points, so many people would know me. I'm a pathologist, a genetic pathologist. And from my perspective, there's a few comments going back to the previous comments, I suppose. As a pathologist, I don't really want to have someone undergoing a genetic test if they don't want to and if they haven't been properly counselled. I think there are so many more risks and dangers there that from even though I don't see patients directly, I feel every one of those tests that's done, genetic tests, every one of them are my patients, and I have a duty of care to them to make sure they're getting an appropriate test and that there is a minimisation of potential harm if we can. And then to the other 2 points that you made, Ainsley, well, I agree, and they're the points that I've made. There is some exceptionalism with genetics because it is a different technology and the implications are definitely different to other modalities of diagnostic testing that we have out there. And the obvious one is the wider familial implications that can occur. But then the other point is that you also made, there are areas where we shouldn't be invoking exceptionalism because this is just further diagnostic information that has structures in place whereby it can add to the decision-making process, but it doesn't necessarily direct it. Now, I understand that given the nature of the technology and the hype and the misunderstanding, that sometimes there can be these notions of pressure that are added because of this testing. But I think that comes down to more the counselling and the education, in that if there are decisions to be made in ICU, that genetic information may not necessarily be used any more than, say, a CT or an ultrasound or a blood test in the decisions that are made by the guidance that the ICU team gives to the parents and then makes those decisions together in a supportive manner.
Thanks, Peter. Fiona or Kirsten, would either of you like to respond or add anything to Peter's points? I should add, it's awesome to have a genetic pathologist here today as well. Thanks so much for coming.
I guess I have a few thoughts about this concept of genetic exceptionalism, and to say that I guess fluctuate between two thoughts because it's actually really difficult, I think, to come with one set opinion on it. And that's because sometimes the test is not going to find anything that's, that different to, a routine blood test, or potentially you'll go into an MRI and find something devastating. That way a genetic diagnosis would just confirm it. What I will say is, all the traditional things that we've talked about, but I guess the flow-on effects of, the recurrence risk for future pregnancies, cascade testing for other family members, but also that parental guilt. So particularly for recessive and X-linked conditions, and knowing, that they've passed on a condition to their child, that's something that's pretty unique to genetics. And I guess maybe, you know, the only other thing I can think of is if there's some kind of infection in a pregnancy that the mother has passed on to her baby. But I guess, yeah, just in terms of genetics, I think that's a big issue that a lot of people, you know, we spend a lot of time exploring that with families, and particularly, you know, we need to be aware of the cultural differences with other families as well, and thinking about the potential impacts of finding recessive conditions or X-linked conditions for those particular families too. I guess something that I've been thinking about as we've been having these discussions is, you know, thinking about, okay, well, what's the difference with, we suspect that there's something going on in the brain, we're going to send this child off for an MRI to see what we can find, and how is that different from doing a rapid genomic test? And I would say it's potentially not, but I would argue that those families actually end up, you know, when they come to us for genetic counselling and potentially they've done an MRI, they've found something, we give them the space to talk about that experience. And what they say to us is, nobody told me that, you know, the potential that we could find something terrible on the MRI, like nobody explained the test to us. They would just sort of took our child and off they went. And it wasn't discussed with us that, you know, that there's the potential for us to find some kind of devastating diagnosis. So potentially I would argue that we're doing a good job in consenting and having these informed decision-making discussions with families, and that potentially other specialists could sort of learn a bit from us potentially in regards to counselling and just, you know, talking about the test and the potential implications of what they might find from doing the test. I guess that's my counter argument.
Thanks, Kirsten. Just having a scroll through the chat as well, I think I'm not sure we're going to be able to address this exceptionalism question unless we stay on the line for another hour. I think it's really something that we all need to think hard about and write about and talk to each other about. Lisa, I'll come to you in a sec. I see your hand. I think we probably won't have time to address these in detail, but I think a couple of the other things that have come up in the chat are questions like considering the potential for regret, what has happened or might happen if a couple disagree about whether this test should proceed. And I guess that's something that could come up in all sorts of contexts here where a child is involved. There's been a bit of discussion throughout the chat around the interests of the child themselves and their place in this, and potentially, of course, if it comes to things that conditions, for example, that might not immediately inform their treatment and what should happen with that information. So just thinking about the interests of the child now and in the future. And also an interesting question around, you know, where trio testing is happening, whether someone says yes for their child but not themselves, which I'll just lob in and say, you know, is in the literature in other forms of exome and genome sequencing in a pediatric context. There was a Canadian study that found that some parents did say that they were happy to receive findings for their kids but not themselves. And right down the bottom, we've now started a discussion about mainstreaming, and Ivan Machoka asked the question about whether, because of course we've got funding for the actual test, but not funding for a lot of the clinical services around it. I know we have Belinda Burns on the line as well, who works in Department of Health in WA and knows just so much about how genomics in Australia is funded. But, you know, we have certain things where the feds or federal government is in control, and things that are more the purview of states through activity-based funding. And it has led to some patchiness. And I think most importantly for our purposes is that genetic counselling isn't funded as to the extent that it should be. And we also know there was recently an application for MBS funding for genetic counselling that didn't get up. I think not all hope is lost, but it's a really complex and slightly intractable thing as to how we can actually fund this well and get all of the services that are required around this form of testing. And so we've ended up having a discussion around who should be administering this in a GC sense, or who should be doing it. Lisa, your hand went away. I'll just check in to see how you're feeling. Did I accidentally ask your question for you or answer it? Sorry.
No, that's okay. I just started to type it into the chat because it was just
Okay.
an addendum to the end of the, I can say it instead, that will be easier and quicker probably. At the tail end of the genomic exceptionalism debate, I was wondering, does it really matter? Do we have to take a stance on genetic exceptionalism? Because I think we've established really early on in this discussion that it's crucially important to do consent really well in the context of rapid newborn genomic testing. And what else are we going to get from having a stance on whether we agree or disagree with genomic exceptionalism? I'm not sure that we...
Oh, yeah, provocative question. Yeah, I'm going to park it just right to the end, and I'm going to give both Fiona and Kirsten a last word. Penny, I see your hand, and I think it's off the back of the discussion that's happening in the chat about mainstreaming. But if you want to ask something else, go for your life. Thanks for putting your hand up.
Thanks so much, Ainsley. Hope you can hear me, and my apologies in advance for my absolutely insane cat in the background. I should have locked her out earlier.
It's okay. My cats constantly meow to get into cupboards as well, so I'm glad that I'm not the only one.
So yes, it is off the back of this mainstreaming. I just wanted to raise a slightly off the tangential point to this. If anyone's interested in just more broadly this question of consenting in relation to new technologies more broadly, I'd be really interested in hearing from you, particularly in terms of, should we be thinking about, I guess, a non-medical model for how we are approaching our use of new technologies, whether it's genomics testing or more broadly. I've actually been thinking over time about whether, in fact, it's not so much about mainstreaming GC so much as expanding the model of GC to other technologies, rather than, I guess, limiting GC even further, but actually expanding it out to more complex technologies that are not related to genomics, which patients are now increasingly having to deal with. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm easily available online, social media, etc. I'm just really interested in different paradigms of starting to think about these sorts of issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Penny. And Penny's at Deakin University, if you find her elusive online. I'm just going to quickly comment. It's at 23 past the hour, due to completely finish at 1:30, including supposedly breakout rooms for chats, which I have often added in these sessions. But I'm just going to check in with everyone. My sense is that this discussion is really engaging and interesting, and I don't feel like we've finished yet. And so if everybody agrees, my sense would be to actually forego breaking out and saying hi to folks, because that's kind of happening organically anyway. And I'd like to use the remainder of our time just to try. I don't think we're going to finish this discussion, but to ensure that everybody who wants to participate can. I'm seeing a few nods. Is that okay? I'm just going to move my thing back to go. Oh, yeah, lots of thumbs up. Awesome. Okay, I will keep us all in one room together. All right. Where am I? Check what I have not talked about yet. All right, I'm just going to throw it open to anyone now. I feel like I've been scrolling up and down the chat, and I feel like I've pegged almost everything. And if I haven't, it's just a genuine oversight on my part, not that I didn't think what you wrote was relevant, because it's all been really important. Would anyone like to pop their hand up and provide any further questions or comments or points for consideration? I can see in the chat, Diana's asked me to provide a paper, which I've gone away and found, so I'll pop that in the chat in a moment. In that case, what I'll do is come back to our two excellent speakers and ask both of you, if you can, just to, 1 or 2 minutes each, I guess, on sort of trying to draw together the key things that have come out for you, and any points that you've got sitting in the back of your minds that you haven't had a chance to raise yet. Kirsten, would you like to go first? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, I guess it's been a really interesting discussion. Obviously, I've been living in this space for a few years now, and so often reflecting and thinking about, you know, the whole process and, you know, all the families that I've seen through the study. I think it's interesting to hear about, you know, the mainstreaming part of this is a bit of a hot topic. I feel like maybe we might get there, but certainly we're not there yet. And we do have a couple of examples, at least in New South Wales, of where we tried to mainstream the consent discussion without having a genetic counsellor available, and that did not go particularly well. Not only from a discussion perspective for the family and facilitating decision making, but even just understanding how to get, you know, what samples we need, how to get those urgently down to the lab, all of those things that, you know, we just have that inherent knowledge because we know the process of getting samples collected and the logistics of getting them sent out urgently, and perhaps other specialties not quite understanding that process and samples going missing and all kinds of things like that, which, you know, in a time critical test, you kind of don't want to be chasing samples around the hospital. And then in terms of result delivery, and I've often reflected on, you know, maybe the consent, if it's not done completely appropriately or correctly, and it should be, but if it's not, then, you know, having a genetic counsellor available for at least the results discussion, you know, hopefully we can help clean up some of the mess that's been made from that initial, you know, if it's not done properly. But yeah, I think we've got a really long way to go in terms of mainstreaming, particularly for this this testing, because it is so nuanced and I guess just things that we as genetic counsellors deal with every day, whereas other subspecialties would not. And just because they've done one doesn't mean that they'll be able to do it again. And we've certainly learnt that along the way as well.
Thank you, Kirsten. Fiona.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to go back to, Lisa, your question about genetic exceptionalism and whether it matters. I think maybe that's not a useful question. I think the question that we want to ask is consent necessary in this setting? And I think most of us, based on our discussion, would agree that it is. And then tying into that mainstreaming question, do we think consent should be done by genetic counsellors? Is it important that genetic counsellors are involved in this? Or is it okay to give that up to a well-trained intensive care clinician? I mean, genetic counselling is something that other health professionals might be able to do with sufficient training. And so there, I think the questions that we really need to be asking, rather than getting bogged down in, is this different? Is it special? Should it be treated differently? I think we really need to be asking, what's the best way to deliver this that will support informed decision-making, that will support families to make the best decisions for them.
Thank you so much to both of you and to everybody who's come today. We are at the half hour pretty much, so I would just conclude by asking everyone to give a virtual clap to Kirsten and Fiona for their mastery of this subject and their passion for ensuring that this technology is developed and used in a way that balances all of these really complex considerations. And for being willing to step outside of their day-to-day and to hear views from a range of folks in the audience who come from lots of different backgrounds. So really superb presentation and engagement in the discussion. And thank you to everyone for such great questions as well. Made my job really easy. I didn't have to use a single one of my pre-prepared questions. So this recording, if you want to go back and revisit it, will be available on the Australian Genomics website in due course. I'd like to acknowledge Australian Genomics for their support of this network. And also I'd like to acknowledge Kitty Jean Lagina, who has helped with a lot of the back end of the organising and setting everything up. And that takes a lot of time. So thank you, Kitty. Please feel free to go off into your afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, and have a great day. Thanks so much.